Welcome to The Debate. Today we are plunging into, well, one of the really great historical enigmas of North America, the dramatic collapse and subsequent transformation of the Mississippian culture, particularly centered at Cahokia. This was an astonishing achievement. I mean, by 1100 CE, Cahokia was this unparalleled urban center, boasting monumental architecture like Monk's Mound, and supporting a vast metropolitan area. Its population rivaled contemporary European capitals, Yet, in just a few centuries, the entire structure just dissolved. The plazas fell silent by 1400 CE. Our central question today really focuses on the driving force behind this dramatic societal unraveling. Was it sustained environmental stress from, devastating climate change? Or was the key factor the internal socio-political fragility and perhaps inherent conflict within that highly stratified Mississippian system?
My position is that these large-scale environmental shifts were the ultimate sort of non-negotiable factor that doomed Cahokia's complexity.
Right, and I'll be arguing that while the climate was, undoubtedly a major stressor, maybe a necessary condition for collapse, the ultimate driver was the catastrophic failure of the rigid, centralized Mississippian political structure. The people, I think the evidence shows, demonstrated an ability to adapt to environmental changes. Their rulers, however, failed to adapt the system of power itself.
This urban density, the intense craft specialization, these massive earthwork projects, and the sophisticated trade networks that hauled copper all the way from Lake Superior and shells from the Gulf Coast, all of it rested entirely, on the back of reliable, intensive maize agriculture. That level of agricultural output, the surplus needed, it was only really possible during the favorable conditions of the medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE. So when the climate began its sustained shift around 1200 CE toward the cooler, more volatile conditions of the Little Ice Age, it introduced an existential stressor the system just could not withstand. And we aren't just speculating here. The paleoclimate data is quite definitive. Research based on Horseshoe Lake sediment cores, for instance, confirms a major long-term reorganization of regional weather patterns, critically reducing warm season precipitation. The initial cooling stressed the system, sure, but the real point of no return seems to have come with a period of severe, sustained drought between about 1350 and 1450 CE. A 100-year dry spell, arguably the most severe the region had seen in 1,600 years. It just gutted the specific high-yield maize production the city required. A society built entirely on predictable agricultural surplus, it simply cannot survive when that foundational engine fails.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I come at the evidence from a different angle. The core issue wasn't the inevitability of climate change. It was the political system's refusal, or maybe inability, to flex when it needed to. The archaeological record actually shows strong evidence of human agency and successful adaptation, suggesting the environment wasn't entirely deterministic, Archaeobotanist Natalie Mueller's research is quite telling here. While maize yields certainly suffered in the shifting climate, the inhabitants actively diversified. Drought-adapted crops like squash, goosefoot, and sumpweed maintain healthy isotopic signatures in the soil record. Cahokia's people were adjusting their diets and farming practices to maintain subsistence. So, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the climate shock alone was the ultimate forcing mechanism. Let me tell you why. The Mississippians adapted their farming, and arguably quite successfully at a local level, they failed to adapt their highly unequal, resource-dependent political structure. The power of the chiefs, it was rooted in two things, wasn't it? Their ritual connection to fertility and rain, and their practical ability to manage and redistribute consistent surplus. When that consistent surplus vanished because of the sustained drought, both their divine and practical legitimacy crumbled. The stockade construction, these massive wooden fortifications requiring 20,000 trees at Cahokia, that's evidence not of inevitable environmental decline, but of acute internal social crisis and, frankly, the desperate breakdown of political order. When you look at the material evidence, the adaptation data is really crucial. If people could successfully shift crops and maintain local subsistence,
Why was there a mass exodus from the urban core?
And why the sudden need for enormous defensive works? This points directly back to internal conflict, likely driven by rising inequality and maybe resource hoarding. The political system, which is so evident in the stark difference between elaborate elite burials and simple commoner graves, it just proved too rigid, too resource-intensive to survive a prolonged period of scarcity. They could perhaps feed themselves locally, but they couldn't sustain the cost of the elite structure.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the adaptation differently. Adaptation that ensures local survival is, well, it's survival, it's laudable, but it is not the same thing as civilization maintenance, is it? Intensive maize agriculture wasn't just the food source. It was the specific, high-caloric, highly storable commodity that served as the economic foundation for the entire social hierarchy, the urban density, the specialization we see. So even if subsistence crops like goosefoot survived, they could never generate the required volume and caloric density of maize surplus necessary to feed 50,000 non-farming residents, the specialized craftspeople, the construction crews for the mounds, and the non-producing elite. The city required that surplus to function as an engine of complexity. Once the reliable maize surplus failed, the city just became economically impossible. The internal conflict and the stockade you cite, while certainly real, can be viewed, I think, as the symptom of a population facing starvation and political failure because the environmental constraints remove the economic capacity for redistribution.
Okay, but if the city's foundation was purely economic, why does the archaeological record show such intense social fracture? Let's look closely at the mortuary practices for a moment. During the height of Cahokia, these elaborate primary burials of elites were the norm, often involving enormous resources, complex rituals. That centralized ritual system seems to break down entirely. These primary burials are increasingly replaced by secondary, almost unceremonious burials, and crucially, by mass graves. This shift suggests a rapid increase in mortality, whether that's through disease or violence, and perhaps more importantly, a catastrophic collapse of standardized ritual practices and, well, social cohesion. We also see the disappearance of standardized warfare iconography from their artistic traditions. This suggests that conflict itself was transforming, maybe moving away from potentially ritualized, elite-controlled conflict into something far more desperate, widespread, and brutal among the common people. This looks like acute societal fracture. People weren't just fleeing a dry field. They were fleeing a breakdown of law and order, possibly fueled by failed leadership.
The beauty of the climate argument for me is its sheer scale and the timeline correlation. The drought and the subsequent cooling were continental phenomena, weren't they? Affecting the entire Mississippian network from Moundville to Spiro to Etowah. The general trend of abandonment, which, begins subtly after the shift around 1200 CE and then accelerates rapidly toward 1400 CE, it aligns almost perfectly with the paleoclimate record for the most severe drought phase. And while I recognize the weight of the social evidence you bring up, I'm not entirely convinced that regional variability proves social factors were decisive. I mean, the fact that some areas like the Middle Cumberland Valley experienced rapid collapse in the late 1200s, earlier than the main Cahokian exodus, could simply reflect regional variation in the localized effects of the drought, perhaps due to specific vulnerability of local agriculture or maybe soil conditions.
The overall system was experiencing a downward spiral dictated by rainfall deficiency. And furthermore, regarding the stockades, if internal conflict was the cause of the collapse, why expend the immense resource of 20,000 trees on defense when mass migration to less stressed areas might have been simpler? That kind of costly defense suggests the population was fighting to maintain their urban center, perhaps against external threats or internal desperation, while already crippled by a resource shortage.
That regional variability strongly suggests that human agency and specific political choices were the key determinants of survival. I mean, if climate were a universal determinant, wouldn't we expect a much more synchronized collapse across the board? Instead, certain peripheral sites, like Leon's Bluff and Lubbock Creek, they survived much longer, some even into the 17th century, precisely because they relied more heavily on wild, non-maize resources, or perhaps they had better localized soil and water access due to smarter settlement choices. These communities made different choices about resource management and political centralization than Cahokia did,
And, well, they survived the climate shift. Moreover, we also have to consider acute non-climate stressors that would disproportionately affect dense, potentially malnourished urban centers. Early exposure to European diseases may be spreading ahead of direct contact from expeditions like De Soder's starting in 1521. That would have been devastating. A population already weakened by drought-induced malnutrition would have faced acute, non-environmental death tolls, providing a final, immediate mechanism for political disintegration and rapid abandonment, wouldn't it?
Well, ultimately, the material record does show that this was a massive, environmentally induced transformation. Archaeologist A.J. White's research, looking at fecal stannuls, these molecular markers in the soil that confirm human population presence and diet, it shows that Native American populations, specifically members of the later Illinois Confederation, did return to the Cahokia region within a century or two, during the 1500s and 1600s. However, and this is key, they practiced a fundamentally different, less intensive way of life. They adopted dispersed, mobile strategies centered on bison hunting and small-scale farming. This new adaptive strategy looks like a direct response to the reality of the climate instability inherent to the Little Ice Age. The environment demanded a fundamental change in the relationship between humans and the landscape.
The political structures that later survived were those designed for mobility and resource dispersion, not that kind of urban density.
Okay, we certainly agree it was a profound transformation. But the fact that they had to fundamentally reinvent their economy and political structure, abandoning the very idea of monumental chiefdoms and elite authority, doesn't that prove that the initial Mississippian system was fatally flawed? Too rigid to weather sustained stress?
That's a compelling argument about the environmental demands, but have you considered the fact that the political system was replaced entirely rather than merely reformed seems to confirm the failure was systemic and political.
The failure to distribute goods, the loss of elite ritual authority during prolonged drought, and the resulting fragmentation, it suggests the complexity itself was the weakness when the environment became unforgiving. The new societies were less vulnerable precisely because they were less centralized.
Generational climate shift, that 100-year drought, created an environmental floor, if you will, below which the massive urban, surplus-dependent Mississippian system simply could not operate. The climate change necessitated the fundamental transformation we observe, pushing societies away from urban density back to smaller, dispersed, and arguably more resilient subsistence patterns. The climate was the driver. The political system was simply the vehicle that broke down under that pressure.
And I would conclude that while the climate certainly provided the necessary stressor, the evidence of successful local adaptation in farming, coupled with those pervasive signs of intense internal conflict, the stockades, the mass burials, the failing elite structure, it all suggests the highly stratified political economy proved too fragile, too brittle. The Mississippian system, in essence, failed itself. It collapsed politically and fragmenting, demonstrating that even a highly sophisticated society can be undone by its own internal structure when resources tighten dramatically.
It's clear the story of the Mississippians is a critical case study in resilience, or perhaps the lack thereof. Whether one focuses primarily on the climate change that served as the trigger, or the specific political system that proved unable to manage that stress, it demonstrates a profound vulnerability when urban complexity is built upon such a finely tuned agricultural foundation.
And the relentless forces of the environment that ultimately shape the trajectory of Cahokia and its complex world. There is clearly much more to explore in the material evidence.